Mrs. Pendyce believed in the practice of assembling county society for the purpose of inducing it to dance, a hardy enterprise in a county where the souls, and incidentally the feet, of the inhabitants were shaped for more solid pursuits. Men were her chief difficulty, for in spite of really national discouragement, it was rare to find a girl who was not fond of dancing. Ah, dancing, I did so love it. Oh, poor Cecil Tharp. And with a queer little smile, she pointed to a strapping, red-faced youth dancing with her daughter. He nearly trips Bee up every minute, and he hugs her so, as if he were afraid of falling on his head. Oh dear, what a bump. It's lucky she's so nice and solid. I like to see the dear boy. Here come George and Helen Bellew. Poor George is not quite up to her form, but he's better than most of them. Doesn't she look lovely this evening? Lady Malden raised her glasses to her eyes by the aid of a tortoiseshell handle. Yes, but she's one of those women you never can look at without seeing that she has a body. She's too, do you see what I mean? It's almost like a Frenchwoman. Mrs. Bellew had passed so close that the skirt of her sea-green dress brushed their feet with a swish, and a scent as of a flower-bed was wafted from it. Mrs. Pendyce wrinkled her nose. Much nicer. Her figure's so delicious, she said. Lady Malden pondered. She's a dangerous woman. James quite agrees with me. Mrs. Pendyce raised her eyebrows. There was a touch of scorn in that gentle gesture. She's a very distant cousin of mine. Her father was quite a wonderful man. It's an old Devonshire family. The Cheritons of Bovey are mentioned in Twisdom. I like young people to enjoy themselves. A smile illumined softly the fine wrinkles around her eyes. Beneath her lavender satin bodice, with strips of black velvet banding it at intervals, her heart was beating faster than usual. She was thinking of a night in her youth when her old playfellow, young Trefane of the Blues, danced with her nearly all the evening, and of how at her window she saw the sun rise and gently wept because she was married to Horace Pendyce.
I always feel sorry for a woman who can dance as she does. I should have liked to have got some men from town, but Horace will only have the county people. It's not fair to the girls. It isn't so much their dancing as their conversation, all about the first meet and yesterday's cubbing and tomorrow's covered shooting and their fox terriers, though I'm awfully fond of the dear dogs, and then that new golf course. Really, it's quite distressing to me at times. Mrs. Pendyce was not exaggerating. The guests at Worsted Skeynes on the night of the Rutlandshire Handicap were nearly all county people, from the Honourable Gertrude Winlow, revolving like a faintly coloured statue, to young Tharp, with his clean face and his fair bullety head, who danced as though he were riding at a bullfinch. In a niche, old Lord Quarryman, the master of the Gaddison, could be discerned in conversation with Sir James Malden and the Reverend Hussel Barter. Mrs. Pendyce said, "Your husband and Lord Quarryman are talking of poachers. I can tell that by the look of their hands. I can't help sympathizing a little with poachers." Lady Malden dropped her eyeglasses. "James takes a very just view of them," she said. "It's such an insidious offence. The more insidious the offence, the more important it is to check it. It seems hard to punish people for stealing bread or turnips, though one must, of course. But I've no sympathy with poachers. So many of them do it for sheer love of sport."
Mrs. Pendyce answered, "That's Captain Maydew dancing with her now. He is a good dancer. Don't their steps fit? Don't they look happy? I do like people to enjoy themselves. There is such a dreadful lot of unnecessary sadness and suffering in the world. I think it's really all because people won't make allowances for each other." Lady Malden looked at her sideways, pursing her lips. But Mrs. Pendyce, by race a Totteridge, continued to smile. She had been born unconscious of her neighbours' scrutinies. Helen Bellew was such a lovely girl. Her grandfather was my mother's cousin. What does that make her? Anyway, my cousin Gregory Vigil is her first cousin once removed, the Hampshire Vigils. Do you know him?
Lady Malden answered, "Gregory Vigil? The man with a lot of grayish hair. I've had to do with him in the SRWC." But Mrs. Pendyce was dancing mentally. "Such a good fellow! What is that Lady Malden gave her a sharp look. "Society for the Rescue of Women and Children, of course. Surely you know about that." Mrs. Pendyce continued to smile. "Ah, yes, that is nice. What a beautiful figure she has. It's so refreshing. I envy a woman with a figure like that. It looks as if it would never grow old. Society for the Regeneration of Women. Gregory's so good about that sort of thing. But he never seems quite successful, have you noticed? There was a woman he was very interested in this spring. I think she drank." "They all do," said Lady Malden. "It's the curse of the day." Mrs. Pendyce wrinkled her forehead. "Most of the Totteridges were great drinkers. They ruined their constitutions. Do you know Jasper Bellew?" "No." "It's such a pity he drinks. He came to dinner here once, and I'm afraid he must have come intoxicated. He took me in. His little eyes quite burned me up. He drove his dog-cart into a ditch on the way home. That sort of thing gets about so. It's such a pity. He's quite interesting. Horace can't stand him." The music of the waltz had ceased. Lady Malden put her glasses to her eyes. From close beside them, George and Mrs. Bellew passed by. They moved on out of hearing, but the breeze of her fan had touched the arching hair on Lady Malden's forehead, the down on her upper lip. "Why isn't she with her husband?" she asked abruptly. Mrs. Pendyce lifted her brows. "Do you concern yourself to ask that which a well-bred woman leaves unanswered?" she seemed to say, and a flush colored her cheeks. Lady Malden winced, but as though it were forced through her mouth by some explosion in her soul, she said, "You have only to look and see how dangerous she is." The color in Mrs. Pendyce's cheeks deepened to a blush like a girl's. "Every man is in love with Helen Bellew. She's so tremendously alive. My cousin Gregory has been in love with her for years, though he is her guardian or trustee or whatever they call them now. It's quite romantic. If I were a man, I should be in love with her myself." The flush vanished and left her cheeks to their true color, that of a faded rose. Once more she was listening to the voice of young Trefane. "Ah, Marjorie, I love you." To her own half-whispered answer, "Poor boy." Once more she was looking back through that forest of her life where she had wandered so long, and where every tree was Horace Pendyce. "What a pity one can't always be young," she said. Through the conservatory door, wide open to the lawn, a full moon flooded the country with pale gold light, and in that light the branches of the cedar trees seemed printed black on the gray-blue paper of the sky. All was cold, still witchery out there, and not very far away, an owl was hooting. The Reverend Hustle Barter, about to enter the conservatory for a breath of air, was arrested by the sight of a couple half hidden by a bushy plant. Side by side they were looking at the moonlight, and he knew them for Mrs. Bellew and George Pendyce. Before he could either enter or retire, he saw George seize her in his arms. She seemed to bend her head back, then bring her face to his. The moonlight fell on it and on the full white curve of her neck. The Reverend of Worsted Skeins saw, too, that her eyes were closed, her lips parted.
Along the walls of the smoking room, above a leather dado, were prints of horsemen in nightshirts and nightcaps, or horsemen in red coats and top hats, with words underneath, such as, "Yokes," says Thruster. "Yokes," says Dick. "My word, these deed-corn-eyes shall now see the trick." 2 pairs of antlers surmounted the hearth, mementos of Mr. Pendyce's dear forest, Strathbogolly, now given up, where, with the assistance of his dear old gillie, Angus MacBain, he had secured the heads of these monarchs of the glen. Between them was the print of a personage in trousers, with a rifle under his arm and a smile on his lips, while 2 large deerhounds worried a dying stag, and a lady approached him on a pony. The squire and Sir James Maldon had retired. The remaining guests were seated round the fire. Gerald Pendyce stood at a side table, on which was a tray of decanters, glasses, and mineral water. "Who's for a drop of the crater? A wee drop of the crater! Rector, a drop of the crater! George, a drop!" George shook his head. A smile was on his lips, and that smile had in it a quality of remoteness, as though it belonged to another sphere, and had strayed on to the lips of this man of the world against his will. He seemed trying to conquer it, to twist his face into its habitual shape, but like the spirit of a strange force, the smile broke through. It had mastered him, his thoughts, his habits, and his creed. He was stripped of fashion, as on a thirsty noon a man stands stripped for a cool plunge, from which he hardly cares if he come up again. And this smile, not by intrinsic merit, but by virtue of its strangeness, attracted the eye of each man in the room. So, in a crowd, the most foreign-looking face will draw all glances. The Reverend Hustle Barter, with a frown, watched that smile, and strange thoughts chased through his mind. "Uncle Charles, a drop of the crater, a wee drop of the crater." General Pendyce caressed his whisker. "The least touch," he said, "the least touch. I hear that our friend Sir Percival is going to stand again." Mr. Barter rose and placed his back before the fire. "Outrageous," he said. "He ought to be told at once that we can't have him." The Honorable Geoffrey Winlow answered from his chair. "If he puts up, he'll get in. They can't afford to lose him." And with a leisurely puff of smoke, "I must say, sir, I don't quite see what it has to do with his public life." Mr. Barter thrust forth his lower lip. "An impenitent man," he said. "But a woman like that, what chance has a fellow if she once gets hold of him?" "When I was stationed at Halifax," began General Pendyce, "she was the belle of the place." Again, Mr. Barter thrust out his lower lip. "Don't let's talk of her, the jade." Then suddenly to George, "Let's hear your opinion, George. Dreaming of your victories, eh?" And the tone of his voice was peculiar. But George got up.
"I'm too sleepy," he said calmly. "Good night." Curtly nodding, he left the room. Outside the door stood a dark oak table covered with silver candlesticks. A single candle burned thereon and made a thin gold path in the velvet blackness. George lighted his candle, and a second gold path leapt out in front. Up this he began to ascend. He carried his candle at the level of his breast, and the light shone sideways and up over his white shirt front and the comely bulldog face above it. It shone, too, into his eyes, grey and slightly bloodshot, as though their surfaces concealed passions violently struggling for expression. At the turning platform of the stair he paused. In darkness above and in darkness below, the country house was still. All the little life of its day, its petty sounds, movements, comings, goings, its very breathing seemed to have fallen into sleep. The forces of its life had gathered into that pool of light where George stood listening. The beating of his heart was the only sound. In that small sound was all the pulse of this great slumbering space. He stood there long, motionless, listening to the beating of his heart, like a man fallen into a trance. Then floating up through the darkness came the echo of a laugh. George started. "The deed parson," he muttered, and turned up the stairs again. But now he moved like a man with a purpose, and held his candle high so that the light fell far out into the darkness. He went beyond his own room and stood still again. The light of the candle showed the blood flushing his forehead, beating and pulsing in the veins at the side of his temples. It was at Barnard Scrolls, the next station to Worsted Skeynes, on the following afternoon, that a young man entered a first-class compartment of the 3:10 train to town. The young man wore a Newmarket coat, natty white gloves, and carried an eyeglass. His face was well-colored, his chestnut mustache well-brushed, and his blue eyes, with their loving expression, seemed to say, "Look at me. Come, look at me. Can anyone be better fed?" His valise and hat box of the best leather bore the inscription, "E. Maydew, 8th Lancers." There was a lady leaning back in a corner, wrapped to the chin in a fur garment, and the young man, encountering through his eyeglass her cool, ironical glance, dropped it and held out his hand. "Ow, Mrs. Bellew. Great pleasure to see you again so soon. You going up to town? Jolly dance last night, wasn't it? Dear old sort, the squire. And Mrs. Pendyce, such an awfully nice woman." Mrs. Bellew took his hand and leaned back again in her corner. She was rather paler than usual, but it became her, and Captain Maydew thought he had never seen so charming a creature. "Got a week's leave, thank goodness. Most awfully slow time of year. Cubbin's pretty well over, and we don't open till the 1st. He turned to the window. There in the sunlight, the hedgerows ran golden and brown away from the clouds of trailing train smoke. Young Maydew shook his head at their beauty. The country's still very blind. Awful pity you've given up your huntin'." Mrs. Bellew did not trouble to answer, and it was just that certainty over herself, the cool assurance of a woman who has known the world, her calm, almost negligent eyes, that fascinated this young man. He looked at her quite shyly. He stretched out that hand and touched the handle of a door, then stood again like a man of stone, listening for the laugh. He raised the candle and it shone into every nook. His throat clicked as though he found it hard to swallow. "I suppose you will become my slave," those eyes seemed to say, "but I can't help you, really." "Did you back George's horse? I had an awfully good race. I was at school with George. Charming fellow, old George." In Mrs. Bellew's eyes, something seemed to stir down in the depths, but young Maydew was looking at his glove. The handle of the carriage had left a mark that saddened him. "You know him well, I suppose, old George?" "Very well. Some fellows, if they have a good thing, keep it so jolly dark. You fond of racin', Mrs. Bellew?" "Passionately. So am I." And his eyes continued, "It's ripping to like what you like." For, hypnotized, they could not tear themselves away from that creamy face, with its full lips and the clear, faintly smiling eyes above the high collar of white fur. At the terminus, his services were refused, and rather crestfallen, with his hat raised, he watched her walk away. But soon, in his cab, his face regained its normal look. His eyes seemed saying to the little mirror, "Look at me come, look at me. Can anyone be better fed?" In the white morning room which served for her boudoir, Mrs. Pendyce sat with an opened letter in her lap. It was her practice to sit there on Sunday mornings for an hour before she went to her room adjoining to put on her hat for church. It was her pleasure during that hour to do nothing but sit at the window, open if the weather permitted, and look over the home paddock and the squat spire of the village church rising among the group of elms. It is not known what she thought about at those times, unless of the countless Sunday mornings she had sat there with her hands in her lap, waiting to be roused at 10:45 by the squire's entrance and his, "Now, my dear, you'll be late." She had sat there till her hair, once dark brown, was turning grey. She would sit there until it was white. One day she would sit there no longer, and, as likely as not, Mr. Pendyce, still well preserved, would enter and say, "Now, my dear, you'll be late," having for the moment forgotten. But this was all to be expected, nothing out of the common. The same thing was happening in hundreds of country houses throughout the 3 kingdoms, and women were sitting waiting for their hair to turn white, who, long before, at the altar of a fashionable church, had parted with their imaginations and all the changes and chances of this mortal life. Round her chair the dear dogs lay. This was their practice too, and now and again the sky, he was getting very old, would put out a long tongue and lick her little pointed shoe, for Mrs. Pendyce had been a pretty woman, and her feet were as small as ever. Beside her on a spindly table stood a china bowl filled with dried rose leaves, whereon had been scattered an essence smelling like sweetbriar, whose secret she had learned from her mother in the old Warwickshire home of the Totteridges, long since sold to Mr. Abraham Brightman.
Mrs. Pendyce, born in the year 1840, loved sweet perfumes and was not ashamed of using them. The Indian summer sun was soft and bright, and wistful, soft and bright were Mrs. Pendyce's eyes, fixed on the letter in her lap. She turned it over and began to read again. A wrinkle visited her brow. It was not often that a letter demanding decision or involving responsibility came to her hands past the kind and just censorship of Horace Pendyce. Many matters were under her control, but were not, so to speak, connected with the outer world. Thus ran the letter. SRWC, Hanover Square, November 1st, 1891. Dear Marjorie, I want to see you and talk something over, so I'm running down on Sunday afternoon. There is a train of sorts. Any loft will do for me to sleep in if your house is full, as it may be, I suppose, at this time of year. On second thoughts, I will tell you what I want to see you about. You know, of course, that since her father died, I am Helen Bellew's only guardian. Her present position is one in which no woman should be placed. I am convinced it ought to be put an end to. That man, Bellew, deserves no consideration. I cannot write of him coolly, so I won't write at all. It is 2 years now since they separated, entirely as I consider through his fault. The law has placed her in a cruel and helpless position all this time, but now, thank God, I believe we can move for a divorce. You know me well enough to realize what I have gone through before coming to this conclusion. Heaven knows if I could hit on some other way in which her future could be safeguarded, I would take it in preference to this, which is most repugnant. But I cannot. You are the only woman I can rely on to be interested in her, and I must see Bellew. Let not the fat and just Benson and his estimable horses be disturbed on my account. I will walk up and carry my toothbrush. Affectionately your cousin, Gregory Vigil.
Mrs. Pendyce smiled. She saw no joke, but she knew from the wording of the last sentence that Gregory saw one, and she liked to give it a welcome, so smiling and wrinkling her forehead, she mused over the letter. Her thoughts wandered. The last scandal, Lady Rose Bethany's divorce, had upset the whole county, and even now one had to be careful what one said. Horace would not like the idea of another divorce suit, and that so close to Worsted Skeins. When Helen left on Thursday, he had said, "I'm not sorry she's gone. Her position is a queer one. People don't like it. The Maldons were quite—" and Mrs. Pendyce remembered with a glow at her heart how she had broken in, "Ellen Maldon is too bourgeoise for anything." Nor had Mr. Pendyce's look of displeasure effaced the comfort of that word. Poor Horace. The children took after him, except George, who took after her brother Hubert. The dear boy had gone back to his club on Friday, the day after Helen and the others went. She wished he could have stayed. She wished. The wrinkle deepened on her brow. Too much London was bad for him. Too much. Her fancy flew to that London which she saw now only for 3 weeks in June and July, for the sake of the girls, just when her garden was at its best, and when really things were such a whirl that she never knew whether she was asleep or awake. It was not like London at all, not like that London under spring skies or an early winter lamplight, where all the passers-by seemed so interesting, living all sorts of strange and eager lives, with strange and eager pleasures, running all sorts of risks, hungry sometimes, homeless even.
So fascinating, so unlike.
"Now, my dear, you will be late." Mr. Pendyce, in his Norfolk jacket, which he was on his way to change for a black coat, passed through the room, followed by the spaniel John. He turned at the door, and the spaniel John turned too. "I hope to goodness Barter'll be short this morning. I want to talk to old Fox about that new chaff cutter." Round their mistress the three terriers raised their heads. The aged Skye gave forth a gentle growl. Mrs. Pendyce leaned over and stroked his nose. "Roy, Roy, how can you, dear?" Mr. Pendyce said, "The old dog's losing all his teeth. He'll have to be put away." His wife flushed painfully. "Oh no, Horace, oh no." The squire coughed. "We must think of the dog," he said. Mrs. Pendyce rose and, crumpling the letter nervously, followed him from the room. A narrow path led through the home paddock towards the church, and along it the household were making their way. The maids and feathers hurried along guiltily by twos and threes. The butler followed slowly by himself. A footman and a groom came next, leaving trails of pomatum in the air. Presently, General Pendyce, in a high, square-topped bowler hat, carrying a Malacca cane and prayer book, appeared walking between Bee and Nora, also carrying prayer books, with fox terriers by their sides. Lastly, the squire, in a high hat, 6 or 7 paces in advance of his wife, in a small velvet toque. The rooks had ceased their wheeling and their cawing. The 5 minutes bell, with its jerky, toneless tolling, alone broke the Sunday hush. An old horse, not yet taken up from grass, stood motionless, resting hind leg with his face turned toward the footpath. Within the churchyard wicket, the rector, firm and square, a low-crowned hat tilted up on his bold forehead, was talking to an old cottager. He raised his hat and nodded to the ladies, then, leaving his remark unfinished, disappeared within the vestry. At the organ, Mrs. Barter was drawing out stops in readiness to play her husband into church, and her eyes, half shining and half anxious, were fixed intently on the vestry door. The squire and Mrs. Pendyce, now almost abreast, came down the aisle and took their seats beside their daughters and the general in the first pew on the left. It was high and cushioned. They knelt down on tall red hassocks. Mrs. Pendyce remained over a minute buried in thought. Mr. Pendyce rose sooner and, looking down, kicked the hassock that had been put too near the seat. Fixing his glasses on his nose, he consulted a worn old Bible, then, rising, walked to the lectern and began to find the lessons. The bells ceased. A wheezing, growling noise was heard. Mrs. Barter had begun to play. The rector, in a white surplice, was coming in. Mr. Pendyce, with his back turned, continued to find the lessons. The service began. Through a plain glass window high up in the right-hand aisle, the sun shot a gleam athwart the Pendyces' pew. It found its last resting place on Mrs. Barter's face, showing her soft, crumpled cheeks painfully flushed, the lines on her forehead, and those shining eyes, eager and anxious, traveling ever from her husband to her music and back again. At the least fold or frown on his face, the music seemed to quiver, as to some spasm in the player's soul. In the Pendyce pew, the 2 girls sang loudly and with a certain sweetness. Mr. Pendyce, too, sang, and once or twice he looked in surprise at his brother, as though he were not making a creditable noise. Mrs. Pendyce did not sing, but her lips moved and her eyes followed the millions of little dust atoms dancing in the long, slanting sunbeam. Its gold path canted slowly from her, then, as by magic, vanished. Mrs. Pendyce let her eyes fall. Something had fled from her soul with the sunbeam. Her lips moved no more. The squire sang 2 loud notes, spoke 3, sang 2 again. The psalms ceased. He left his seat and, placing his hands on the lectern's sides, leaned forward and began to read the lesson. He read the story of Abraham and Lot, and of their flocks and herds, and how they could not dwell together, and as he read, hypnotized by the sound of his own voice, he was thinking, "This lesson is well read by me, Horace Pendyce. I am Horace Pendyce. Horace Pendyce. Amen, Horace Pendyce." And in the first pew on the left, Mrs. Pendyce fixed her eyes upon him, for this was her habit, and she thought how, when the spring came again, she would run up to town alone and stay at Green's Hotel, where she had always stayed with her father when a girl. George had promised to look after her and take her round the theaters, and forgetting that she had thought this every autumn for the last 10 years, she gently smiled and nodded. Mr. Pendyce said, "And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee." Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. Here endeth the first lesson. The sun, reaching the second window, again shot a gold pathway athwart the church. Again the millions of dust atoms danced, and the service went on. There came a hush. The spaniel John, crouched close to the ground outside, poked his long black nose under the churchyard gate. The fox terriers, seated patient in the grass, pricked their ears. A voice speaking on one note broke the hush. The spaniel John sighed. The fox terriers dropped their ears and lay down heavily against each other. The rector had begun to preach. He preached on fruitfulness, and in the first right-hand pew, 6 of his children at once began to fidget. Mrs. Barter, sideways and unsupported on her seat, kept her starry eyes fixed on his cheek. A line of perplexity furrowed her brow. Now and again she moved as though her back ached. The rector quartered his congregation with his gaze, lest any amongst them should incline to sleep. He spoke in a loud-sounding voice. God, he said, wished men to be fruitful, intended them to be fruitful, commanded them to be fruitful. God, he said, made men and made the earth. He made man to be fruitful in the earth. He made man neither to question, nor answer, nor argue. He made him to be fruitful and possess the land. As they had heard in that beautiful lesson this morning, God had set bounds, the bounds of marriage, within which man should multiply. Within those bounds it was his duty to multiply, and that exceedingly, even as Abraham multiplied. In these days, dangers, pitfalls, snares were rife. In these days men went about and openly, unashamedly advocated shameful doctrines. Let them beware. It would be his sacred duty to exclude such men from within the precincts of that parish entrusted to his care by God. In the language of their greatest poet, such men were dangerous. Dangerous to Christianity, dangerous to their country, and to national life. They were not brought into this world to follow sinful inclination, to obey their mortal reason. God demanded sacrifices of men. Patriotism demanded sacrifices of men. It demanded that they should curb their inclinations and desires. It demanded of them their first duty as men and Christians, the duty of being fruitful and multiplying, in order that they might till this fruitful earth, not selfishly, not for themselves alone. It demanded of them the duty of multiplying in order that they and their children might be equipped to smite the enemies of their queen and country and uphold the name of England in whatever quarrel against all who rashly sought to drag her flag in the dust.
The squire opened his eyes and looked at his watch. Folding his arms, he coughed, for he was thinking of the chaff-cutter. Beside him, Mrs. Pendyce, with her eyes on the altar, smiled as if in sleep. She was thinking, skywards in Bond Street used to have lovely lace. Perhaps in the spring I could, or there was goblins, their point de Venise. Behind them, 4 rows back, an aged cottage woman, as upright as a girl, sat with a rapt expression on her carved old face. She never moved. Her eyes seemed drinking in the movements of the rector's lips. Her whole being seemed hanging on his words. It is true her dim eyes saw nothing but a blur. Her poor deaf ears could not hear one word. But she sat at the angle she was used to and thought of nothing at all. And perhaps it was better so, for she was near her end. Outside the churchyard, in the sun-warmed grass, the fox terriers lay one against the other, pretending to shiver, with their small bright eyes fixed on the church door, and the rubbery nostrils of the spaniel John worked ever busily beneath the wicket gate.